Hello everyone and welcome to our SP Docket webinar. My name is Tony from SP Docket, and today my dear friend Sean McDonough is going to deliver us a session on SharePoint disaster recovery and everything related to that topic. It should be very interesting, and Sean is a great guy and very knowledgeable about this topic, and you guys are going to learn a lot of new things today. If you have any questions, just type them into the questions box, and Sean will try to answer some of these at the end, and we are also going to provide you a recording and some follow-up blog post that's going to explain some stuff that Sean might not get into today. So Sean, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Tony. And thank you everyone for joining. As Tony said, my name is Sean McDonough, and I am here to talk about SharePoint disaster recovery, primarily from a planning perspective. My name, well, we went through that, but I'm the Chief Technology Officer, or CTO, for a company called Pate Group. We're a small consulting company based here in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States. And I am an MVP for both Office development and Office servers and services. I was fortunate enough to be recognized in April of 2016, so my renewal's coming back up. In any case, today I'd like to talk to you about a handful of things. Before we jump right into that, I want to give you a little bit of background about me, or like I tell people, how I got SharePoint chocolate in my DR peanut butter, for anybody who remembers the old Reese's commercials. I've been doing disaster recovery since, well, for quite some time, and it started long before I actually touched SharePoint. I began in the financial services and insurance industry a number of years ago. I was tasked with helping a company build out their first incarnation of a disaster recovery center. And this was around the same time Sarbanes-Oxley was coming out here in the United States, which was a mandate for companies to operate more transparently and share things that they are and aren't doing. And for companies who weren't really protecting data appropriately, Sarbanes-Oxley was a wake-up call. And so around that time is when I started doing disaster recovery, primarily from an application perspective, trying to make applications available in alternate facilities in case our production environment went down. And then in 2004, I moved over to working with SharePoint. And like many folks who got their start doing development, because my background is actually development, I was doing SharePoint and building Webparts for Portal Server 2003. These days, I switch between IT pro and developer hats like so many other folks do with SharePoint. We're just kind of in that role because we have to be. And actually, the peanut butter and chocolate coming together happened around the 2007 timeframe. That's when I was asked to do tech editing for a disaster recovery book that was being written. Ultimately became one of the co-authors for that book, and we ended up putting 2 versions out. The SharePoint Disaster Recovery Guide 2007 and then 2010. So I've spent a lot of time working with SharePoint and doing disaster recovery, and I regularly speak, blog, and work on different DR topics. And so that's a little bit about why I'm giving this talk today. The additional whys around this are, since I've been talking about disaster recovery for so long, I've often seen and given myself many presentations that talk about the technical reasons and technical targets for disaster recovery. How do we do things like backups? How do we do high availability? All those sorts of things. And in my opinion, not enough has been done to really discuss the choices and processes that go into disaster recovery planning. The stuff that I like to call the non-gearhead stuff. These are things that business continuity planners and other folks who are really just interested with keeping systems running and the business processes that they support, keeping those alive. These are the sorts of things that these folks work on and worry about. So for this talk, I don't assume too much. This is pretty much a 100-level talk, and I don't assume that you know too much about DR other than maybe it's a good idea for your organization, and that you're interested in the end-to-end DR process more than just strictly technical concerns. We will touch on technical reasons and technical implementation details in a little, not going very deep. We'll mention them as ways that we can do protection and things like that. But this is really more of a process talk and a planning talk, a strategy talk. You don't have to take notes. SharePoint interface is my blog. I'll have these notes, basically the PDF from this session out there after the presentation, but I also know the folks at Acceleratio are recording this, so this webinar will be available, and they've also got a copy of my slides. So if you're interested in the materials, we will find some way to get it to you. So in the time that we have, here are the things that I'd like to do. I'd like to discuss what I call the big picture, and this is taking a step back, looking at disaster recovery planning from the big picture perspective, all of the concerns and more of the strategic level. Then I want to go into looking at the DR process itself, and in particular how SharePoint and disaster recovery come together, because SharePoint, we all know that SharePoint is a unique snowflake, right? There are so many special things about SharePoint, and that certainly carries over into the disaster recovery field as well. There are certain things we have to do with SharePoint that we don't have to worry about so much with other systems, but it's SharePoint, so naturally there are going to be special things happening. So the big picture. How many of you, well, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Russian nesting dolls, right? This idea that we have a doll, you open it up, there's a smaller one inside of it, et cetera, et cetera. That's a really good analogy for disaster recovery, because disaster recovery is many different things and has many different layers, kind of like the onion that I'm showing you right here. Also like an onion, chances are, as you peel the layers back in SharePoint and disaster recovery, you're probably going to cry. Disaster recovery is one of those topics that once we get into it and we realize everything that needs to be done, it tends to be somewhat painful. And I know I'm making light of this, but having gone through it myself several times, I know that humor sometimes helps. Hopefully you're in the same boat as me. So many folks think that the disaster recovery plan is the starting point. You get tasked with creating a disaster recovery plan, and so you want to go and do it. Well, from a strategic perspective, the disaster recovery plan is the end point, because no disaster recovery plan exists on its own. It really exists within what's called a business continuity plan, or a BCP. And of course, BCPs are driven from what are called business impact analyses, BIAs. And to do a business impact analysis, really one needs to first conduct a risk analysis. And so as you can see, as you start to tackle this process, you actually start on the outside and work your way in. The disaster recovery plan is one of the last things you're going to come to. There's a lot that should happen before you ever actually get to writing a DR plan. And if these things aren't happening, it sometimes results in the creation of a DR plan that isn't appropriate for SharePoint or our own environment. So let's take a look at each of these phases, because this is the high-level strategy that you really have to comprehend and understand in order to arrive at a good starting point to write your disaster recovery plan. So let's start with the risk analysis. A risk analysis is something that seeks to identify and quantify probable threats to normal business operations and activity. We're talking about all the sorts of things that could go wrong. You've heard of the proverbial meteor strike. More often than not, these days it could easily be an outage in a data center. It could be a power-related incident. Somebody tripped over the server and kicked the cord out. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio. We have the Ohio River that flows through Cincinnati. And it's not so many years ago that we hit flood stage with the Ohio River, and it came up to about 3rd Street here in Cincinnati. Well, there are many businesses who had basements underwater. And I also know that some businesses were keeping things like backup tapes in their basements. Instead of sending them out with Iron Mountain to be stored somewhere else, folks were storing them on site. So as you can imagine, you might think the flood, you may live in the middle of a desert and a flood doesn't apply to you, but floods are things that we have to worry about. We all have different sorts of disasters. So we're trying to identify what could go wrong, and then we're attempting to quantify what the realistic probability of something going wrong is. And if we can find some way to quantify probability and severity of some risk condition being realized, we get to something of an overall risk. And I'm talking about this rather abstractly right now, but there are systems for putting numbers to these. If you're not familiar with the Disaster Recovery Journal, drj.com, it's a really good starting point for white papers, articles, references, things like that. You can go out there, you sign up, they'll send you email every now and then, but they do have a publication they put out. They also run a conference yearly for folks who are in this particular space, and so if you're trying to get your feet wet with disaster recovery and you've been tasked with doing something for your organization, you may want to start here because it's free and it will allow you to familiarize yourself with some of the terminology, some of the things that I'm going to be sharing with you as well. So from the risk analysis, we then drive down to what's called a business impact analysis. And a BIA maps risk with business processes. So what we're trying to do in this is build a matrix of any given risk condition and map that across to business processes that might be impacted in the event that a risk, a disaster scenario is realized. And so the business impact analysis is very important for a few reasons. It ultimately is, we're driving towards this matrix that I'm talking about, but what we're also trying to do is determine an estimate or quantify in some way, shape, or form what an interrupted process means to our organization. And we oftentimes do this in dollars per hour. There isn't a magic formula to this, and it is kind of difficult to describe from a procedural perspective. There are many organizations out there that provide services that help with this sort of thing. And if you're new in this area, I recommend that you maybe talk with one of these organizations to make progress or at least start in your own environment. But you know, for purposes of discussion today, the BIA, like I said, gets down to dollars per hour of downtime. And when we can get to dollars per hour of downtime, that helps us to prioritize which systems we want to protect and which processes are critical to our organization. Because naturally, if we have a process that's costing us 10,000 US dollars per hour downtime, we're going to prioritize that more highly in terms of protection and resource than we would perhaps something that's a tenth of that. So it helps from a prioritization perspective. And something else that comes out of the BIA is when we're looking at windows of downtime, this is typically the point in the process where we start to talk about acceptable loss and downtime windows. And these are key outputs from this phase. They're very important, and we'll be using these in the actual disaster recovery planning process itself. So I'll mention a couple of acronyms, RPO and RTO. And it's okay if you don't know what those are. I'm going to go over them in a bit. But those are key outputs that typically come during this phase of planning. So then we get into what's called a business continuity plan. A business impact analysis ultimately yields one or more business continuity plans. And a BCP attempts to define processes, to mitigate any sort of disruption we have, and to define conditions where we can continue to operate our business in the event of a disaster. So a BCP is going to cover things like manual procedures and workarounds to keep things moving, because typically if we've got an outage due to a disaster, we're not going to be able to get access to all of our systems. So manual workarounds are probably going to be in effect in some case, or rather in some ways. Key informational logistical plans to address unavailable facilities, equipment, and personnel. People may not be available. We may have lost our main facility. We may have lost servers. These are all things the BCPs seek to cover. Important in this, of course, are communication plans, because in the event of a disaster, communication is very important, both before, during, and after a disaster as well, because sometimes we don't even know when to declare a disaster. And communication plans help to spell out some of those things. And you'll notice here, underlined, I have disaster recovery plans, because a disaster recovery plan sits within a BCP. And a disaster recovery plan, or just a recovery plan, documents requirements and steps for restoring systems. So in our case, you know, SharePoint. You'll notice I haven't even talked about SharePoint yet. What I'm talking about is broadly applicable across a range of systems and processes. But of course it is relevant to SharePoint as well. And what we're trying to do with the recovery plan is restore a system to agreed upon levels of functionality. So what is in a recovery plan? Well, typically we're talking about what we're going to do with the plan, what it addresses, and it's equally important to identify what we're not going to address. Plans aren't necessarily these large monolithic documents that seek to bring everything back magically. Really, it's more of a quick treatment sort of approach where we're trying to bring back the most critical systems as quickly as possible. So there are going to be things that get left out as well. We also have to identify things like prerequisites in terms of hardware, software, facilities, etc. SharePoint in particular has quite a few things that it relies upon, so dependencies are important. You know, you can't bring up SharePoint without SQL Server, without Windows Server, without having the right servers in place. If you're sending email out, you need mail gateways, things like that. Recovery plans document procedures for recovery. And important in this that sometimes gets lost, measurable success criteria for recovery. Sure, I've executed a process, but is my system actually back up and working? Well, if we don't have recovery processes documented with success criteria, we may not know, because reaching the end of a procedure doesn't necessarily mean you've got a functional system. So this is the strategic overview, what I like to call the big picture. And you'll notice from a risk analysis over to the disaster recovery plan, we move from something that's more abstract, strategic, and businessy from the risk analysis side over down to the disaster recovery plan, where we end up talking in terms that are more concrete, more technical, and more tactical. Now, there are many different ways to quantify disaster risks and build contingency plans. You know, the methodology that I'm sharing here, the broad methodology, is one approach. There are multiple approaches. Form isn't nearly as important as simply ensuring that you have a strategy, and more importantly, applying that strategy consistently across all areas. You want to make sure that all of your systems and all of your processes are evaluated and treated according to the same set of criteria. It goes without saying that disaster recovery is one of those areas where organizational politics can come into play. Some people feel that their systems are more important than perhaps the actual dollars identify them as being. So being able to take a strategy or a methodology and apply it consistently to rank and prioritize systems is very important. So that's kind of the big picture. And, you know, the big picture is a good place to start, but going forward, we're going to be looking at the actual DR process itself. And the DR process, you heard me mention this a little bit earlier, we have certain requirements or targets that drive our processes and drive our planning. I mentioned two things, RPO and RTO. And this is probably a good point at which to define those acronyms. So RPO and RTO. RPO is what's called a recovery point objective. RTO is a recovery time objective. You're probably thinking, hey, that's great, but what do they actually mean? Well, they define operational windows that guide and inform our selection of technologies and strategies for recovery. So what does that actually mean? Well, examples are often the easiest way to get into this, so let's just launch into it. So a recovery point objective is something that I like to say looks backward and defines a maximum acceptable data loss. What do I mean by that? Well, and it may seem a little, you know, it's worth acknowledging. It may seem it may not make much sense here. I'm talking about data loss. Why am I talking about data loss if I'm talking about protecting systems? Well, as it turns out, we oftentimes have to accept certain amounts of data loss with any given protection strategy. So let me start by talking about an example. Let's say it's July 4th. This happens to be July 4th, 2011. Here in the United States, we have a time-honored tradition on the 4th of July of doing something called shooting off fireworks. And many cities across the United States hold large displays of fireworks, and people will sometimes gather downtown or in other areas to watch fireworks displays. So let's say that you're working for a company that happens to have an office in your downtown city, and the 4th of July comes around, fireworks are being shot off. Let's say one of those mortars from the firework goes astray. Let's say it goes through the window of your office building into your data center and explodes. Horrible situation, right? Your data center just took a mortar. Your phone is ringing like crazy. You're getting automated messages. Servers are down. You've encountered a disaster. Now, this is our situation for looking at what RPO and RTO mean. So if you're downtown and it's 11 o'clock at night and that mortar goes through the window, you've got, of course, a disaster being declared at roughly 11 o'clock at night on the 4th of July. That's our scenario. So how does RPO factor into this? Well, let's say that we currently rely on nightly backups for protection of our data, and we run our backups at midnight every night. So in the case of this situation, we have a disaster at 11 o'clock, midnight rolls around. That's when our next scheduled backup is due to kick off. Well, obviously, we're not going to be able to do that. Our system is down, and we actually need to rely on backups from the previous night, right? It's midnight from the previous night that we're pulling in a backup, and once we have servers set up so that we can do a restore, we're going to apply that last backup. Now, if you consider this for a second, this is where RPO comes into play, because if we're using a nightly backup strategy, we're said to have an RPO, or a recovery point objective, or satisfy a recovery point objective of 24 hours, because we stand to lose up to 24 hours of data in the event of a disaster. You can imagine if this situation had occurred at 11:59 at night, we would have lost nearly 24 hours of data. So the selection of a backup strategy has to take RPO into account, because what I'm showing you here, I have cause and effect reversed. We don't normally pick a strategy and then talk about the RPO associated with it. We talk about the RPO we need to satisfy and then pick a strategy that works with that RPO. So if my data protection needs identify that I cannot lose more than an hour's worth of data, a nightly backup strategy, for instance, is not going to be an appropriate technology selection for my scenario, because nightly backups happen once every 24 hours. And if I can't lose more than an hour's worth of data, I need to fall back to something else, perhaps a high availability strategy, perhaps aggressive log shipping, something like that. So that's what RPO is. Now, RTO is the complement on the other side of the timeline. RTO looks forward and defines how much time we have to get things working again. So considering the case of our disaster here, if we have a disaster at 11 p.m. at night and we have an RTO window of 8 hours, what that means is from the point of declaration of the disaster, we have up to 8 hours to get things working again. So the clock starts ticking, and in this case, we have until 7 a.m. the following morning to bring back a predetermined level of functionality in our environment. Now, if we meet that, if we get things working by 7 o'clock, or even better, if we get them working earlier, everything's good. If we miss that recovery target and we fall after 7 o'clock, then we've got a real problem. Hopefully your resume wasn't stored in SharePoint, because at that point you've got a career-altering event potentially. But remember, these values, these RPO and RTO values, if we think back to the strategy I talked about, they're determined during the business impact analysis. And it's also in that phase where we've identified that every hour of downtime has a certain dollar value attached to it. So for us, restoring SharePoint, we may not think too much about an extra hour or two, but somebody in the business continuity field is going to look at that and say, well, you cost your company 2 extra hours of downtime, and it has this dollar value associated with it. That's why RTOs are so important. And of course, an RTO is going to help determine our choice of technology for protecting in a certain situation. Because if we have very aggressive RTO targets, backups may not be appropriate. For instance, if we have to get things up and running within 15 minutes, well, we're probably looking at a high availability strategy as a primary means of getting things running or failing over again. But if we have days, then perhaps backups or even a full system rebuild and reentry of data may be acceptable. So this is where RPO and RTO help to define what technologies and approaches are acceptable in our particular situation. So the focus going forward is going to be on the DR process itself. And like I said, this is driven by RPO and RTO requirements. Allow me for just 1 second to preach, because this is a very important point I want to make. And it's so important, I even wrote a blog post on it, so that if you're talking with folks in your organization who don't get it, you can point them to the blog post. Risk analysis, BIA, BCP, these all feed into a disaster recovery plan. And if you look at where certain determinations are made, RPO and RTO are determined up in the risk analysis, the business impact analysis, etc. It's up in the strategic planning level. Implementation takes place down at the recovery plan level. We're moving from business to technical. This is the important point. If you're trying to build a recovery plan without business input, you're doing it wrong. Oftentimes, I've seen this a number of times, and I've worked with organizations who've been put in this position. Somebody comes to the IT organization and says, hey, I need protection for my data. I need you to implement DR. And without thinking twice, somebody in the IT organization goes, okay, well, I'll set up backups. I'll start running nightly backups. Is that sufficient? Maybe, maybe not. If you don't have the conversations about RPO and RTO, those nightly backups are a gamble, because maybe they will work for your organization. But if you don't have the conversations with the business folks on the front end, you're never going to know if the RPO and RTO associated with those nightly backups is acceptable for the data that's being protected. It's kind of like, using a DR plan to wag the dog. The tail is wagging the dog. Your DR plan is wagging your business continuity strategy. If I haven't beat the horse to death enough for you, this is the blog post where I talk about RPO and RTO and how those need to feed into the actual selection of technologies in the recovery planning process. So don't go out and just throw a technology solution in place to fix your disaster recovery problem. Have the tough conversations up front to ensure that you're doing something that addresses your actual business users' needs. They'll thank you, and ultimately it'll probably help you keep your job. So let's talk about the DR process. And this is the way a lot of folks see disaster recovery. The first domino, if I push the first domino, it's going to tip the second over and the third. It's going to go in a nice chain all the way to the end. A lot of folks would like to think that if they follow a process to plan for disasters, they write those recovery plans, they're going to be done. I'm here to tell you that's not exactly true. The disaster recovery process is cyclical, and so really we're looking at a system of constant iteration. Starts with assessment, planning, down to implementation, maintenance, and then ultimately we reassess where we're at, and we go through this over and over again. Sometimes people call it a never-ending cycle of pain. I can attest to that being partially true, but we've got to start somewhere. So let's jump in with assessment. Assessment is where we start to build an understanding of the SharePoint platform itself and SharePoint environment as it exists today in your data center or your place of business. And this is accomplished typically through 2 D words. The first D word is discovery. We have to go in and we have to look at things. We have to look at logical architecture, physical deployment. We need to look at the data that's being used in our environment, so configuration data and business data or content. And then very important, dependencies and interfaces between SharePoint and other systems. Now, before I go too far, I talked about discovery. I should probably talk about the other D word. And this is the one that tends to make people unhappy. You're going to have to document your discoveries in SharePoint itself. Documentation is that thing that many of us just hate, but it is absolutely critical when we're talking about disaster recovery. And believe it or not, there are tools that can help. And in fact, Acceleratio has tools that can help. That's why I love to talk about SP.Kit, because it is invaluable whenever I'm doing disaster recovery planning. So first, let's talk about the discovery things. The things we need to discover. We need to look at the logical architecture in our environment. We need to focus on SharePoint from a software and services perspective and look at how those different components and services relate to one another with particular attention on the items that we're using. So if we have a collaboration farm, we may not care about business intelligence, and it doesn't make sense to talk about business intelligence in the context of our recovery plan. So we need to focus on things in SharePoint that make sense. Now, if you go out to TechNet, you'll find in some of the DR planning documentation, you'll find that they call out certain things like IIS application pools, web app policies, content databases, things like that. That's Microsoft's presentation for the logical architecture. You may have this, you may have, in fact, you probably have most of this, but you probably have plenty of other pieces that are in play as well. The goal, though, is to show how the pieces in SharePoint are coming together, how you use them, and how they interrelate. And it's important here that we cover some basics for SharePoint itself, not just our environment, but how SharePoint works. The rationale being that we don't want to end up in a situation where somebody is trying to recover SharePoint, and let's say that person knows nothing about that SharePoint, knows nothing about SharePoint. Are they going to have what they need in order to actually be able to put SharePoint back together? SharePoint doesn't behave like a lot of other systems, remember? It is a unique snowflake. And so as much information as we can arm somebody with to do the recovery, they will appreciate that, and they will probably thank us later in the event of a disaster. So cover some SharePoint basics as well as things that we're using in our environment. Now, I talked about logical architecture. That was software and services. The physical architecture is what most IT pros are more comfortable working with. These are the pieces and parts that we put together in our environment to make SharePoint work from a physical perspective. So we're talking about servers, we're talking about SANs, firewalls, SMTP gateways, don't forget Active Directory. All these different things are in play from a physical architecture perspective. And this is where many IT pros and architects pull open Visio, start drawing boxes and lines, talking about IP addresses, talking about bandwidth, things like that. That's the physical architecture side of things. The software and services from the logical architecture reside on our physical architecture and give us our operational environment. Now, of course, virtualization is the monkey wrench that makes all of this a bit more complicated. Most of us are using virtualization in some form in our environment. So we may have, there isn't a one-to-one mapping between logical architecture and physical architecture. We can have highly available VMs running across multiple pieces of hardware. Of course, we can have a single piece of hardware running multiple VMs, and so we may have our entire logical stack sitting on a single VM. It's kind of interesting, up until recently, folks didn't really treat VMs in the same way that they treated their physical servers. If you go back to 2012, you get some interesting numbers around the way that people treated VMs in their environment. And this is a survey from Acronis, who makes a variety of tools for backup and restore purposes. But they did a survey and discovered that people weren't treating their virtual machines the same way they were treating their physical machines. Well, nowadays, I'd like to think that people are actually treating VMs the same way that they're treating their physical servers. But if you're not, you may want to revise your thinking on that, because VMs are just as important in your environment as the actual pieces of hardware that they're running on. So give that some thought. Now, we talked about logical architecture, physical architecture. What we also need to worry about is the data that's in use within our environment. And I break data out into two different categories. One side of the coin, we've got configuration data. And this is the data that makes SharePoint work. It's the data that drives the operation of our farm. And this commonly includes data that sits in the farm configuration database, non-content service application databases, web config files, things like that. You may be looking at this configuration data and thinking, well, what about alternate access mappings? What about SMTP gateway settings and things like that? I'm focusing specifically on things like files and databases here, because these are things that I can protect. Initially, it's more important to understand where data resides and the form it takes, than to actually document all those settings. Because if I can identify a set of databases and files where all of my configuration data resides, I can target that for some form of automated backup. Now, since I'm talking about backup and automated backup, it's important to note that you should pay close attention to secure configuration data or configuration data that's stored in a tough-to-reach manner. Think about something like the Secure Store database. When you set up SharePoint, if you're using something like BCS, Business Connectivity Services, oftentimes you'll set up a secure store in your environment, and the secure store is where passwords and usernames are kept to log into other systems. Well, before you set that service application up, SharePoint asks you for one thing in particular, a password. And it tells you, don't lose this password. If you lose this password, you're not going to be able to get back into your data. And the reason for that, of course, is it uses the password to encrypt the secure store database where your usernames and passwords are stored. Even if you protect the database by itself and you're not there, you're not to the end point until you also protect that password and keep it somewhere else separately. Another good example is SQL Server Transparent Data Encryption. TDE, if you use TDE in your environment, if you try and take a database from your SQL Server environment and mount it in another SQL Server environment without having the appropriate certificates, asymmetric key sets, etc., that TDE needs to run, you're locked out of your SQL Server databases. So secure data, oftentimes, if we're protecting something with an automated solution like backup, we also need some ancillary process to protect passphrases, key sets, things like that. So pay attention to those items. Business data is the other side of the coin. And if you remember nothing else, content databases are number one. This is where the overwhelming majority of end-user content exists in SharePoint. If you're protecting the content databases, at a minimum, you're at least protecting the overwhelming majority of data that people care about. Now, that's not all of it, because nowadays with service applications, we have some spillover into other databases. Think about the managed metadata to service. Managed metadata, we're building taxonomies and term sets. Those may be cached or exist in some form in a content database, but really they live in the managed metadata service application database. So content databases are important, but we also have some additional content that resides in perhaps service application databases. And then, of course, dependencies and interfaces. These are the points where SharePoint touches other line of business systems, including other SharePoint farms. Consider these examples. HR data that's consumed through an external list using Business Connectivity Services, or BCS. That data to end users looks like it lives in SharePoint, but in reality, the system of record for that data is somewhere else in your environment. You're simply consuming it and presenting it through SharePoint. Think about an environment where you have a services-only SharePoint farm. Search is a good example. You may set up, if you work in a sufficiently large environment, you may set up SharePoint to crawl all the content in your environment. You may have a farm that does nothing but crawl other SharePoint farms, and then through the magic of service application proxies connecting cross-farm, you can consume that search data in a different SharePoint farm. Well, that's a dependency. The page viewer Webparts, another good one. This exposes non-SharePoint web applications using an iframe. The reality is this went out of style a while ago, but came back in, of course, with SharePoint 2013's app model and now the 2016 add-in model, because if you're using provider-hosted applications, believe it or not, you're doing the same thing that a page viewer web part used to do. You're slapping an iframe on the page, and you're using a window of sorts on that page to another system. So you're relying on that application to supply the content that basically lives and interacts with your SharePoint environment. InfoPath and other form solutions are another good one. They pull data from or write data to non-SharePoint systems, and they're critical for some of our business processes, but they aren't strictly by themselves SharePoint. So it's important to identify all of these dependencies and interfaces, because ultimately we need to identify what we're going to include and exclude from our SharePoint DR plan. So let's talk for just a second about tools. There are tools that can help you with all of this documentation and discovery. If you're a Visio person, technical diagrams for SharePoint 2013, 2016, there are stencils out there for Visio. You can go out, download those for free, throw them into your environment, and you can start documenting all you want. PowerShell farm documentation is another good one. What this does, these are PowerShell scripts that will, if you're familiar with SharePoint types and the object model, will walk through the farm from the SP farm level all the way down to the SP site level and dump out the various configuration settings in your environment. Now this is XML serialization of .NET objects. So what you're going to end up with is a large number of XML files with a lot of data, only some of which is useful. So it'll capture everything in your environment, but you're going to have to pick through that data to actually make heads or tails of what settings should be. A far better way of doing this is the documentation toolkit for SharePoint, or SP.kit, what our friends here at Acceleratio make. This tool is basically the same thing as PowerShell farm documentation for DR purposes, but what it does is it intelligently extracts all that information from your farm environment and allows you to generate a nice looking doc file or PDF, or to serialize that data off in some other way. It's a fantastic tool to get a handle on your environment, what you've got various settings set for, how your service applications are configured, application accounts, user accounts, things like that. All of that information, it does this for you. And so in my opinion, I love to talk about SP.kit whenever I'm talking about documenting for DR purposes, because it makes it so darn easy. All you have to do is run the tool and generate a report. You don't have to comb through all of those pages in SharePoint. So that's assessment. Now, everything we do during assessment ultimately filters into the planning process. And when we're talking about planning, what we're talking about is taking our assessment results, which once you've actually done SharePoint DR planning, you may be overwhelmed with data at first. It's okay. You would be forgiven if you look like this gentleman. Add together the RTO and RPO windows that you've been assigned, or maybe that you've concluded yourself, because remember, we're not doing this in a vacuum. We're doing this with input from our business constituents. And if we combine those two things, we get a recovery plan. Well, unfortunately, there's just a little bit more to it than that. Even though that formula is correct in the abstract, we need to do some additional things to actually make this happen. We need to define scope and granularity for our plan. We need to define the recovery targets, the items that we're actually going to protect and bring back. And of course, we need to make certain determinations about technology. So when it comes to scope and granularity, common questions we get: do we treat SharePoint as a big system? What's not in scope for our plan? How do we handle regional disasters like earthquake, flood, or attack? This carries data center implications. And strikingly, back in 2012, that same Acronis survey I cited earlier, a number of organizations didn't have off-site backup strategies in place, and a significant number relied on on-site backups that were physically taken off-site each day. This is the Iron Mountain strategy. The van pulls up, picks up your tapes, and drives away. That's hopefully changing, but just be aware, off-site facilities are important for many scenarios, and you need to consider those in your planning. Now, can you, or do you even want to, leverage the cloud? We all talk about the cloud nowadays, and the cloud brings certain advantages, but it's not a silver bullet. Cloud computing has the capability to take our data and make it available just about everywhere. And in the case of certain cloud offerings, I'm thinking about Azure Site Recovery, for instance, with Microsoft, we can bring up VMs in the cloud and run our systems in the cloud as a fallback strategy. Now, while cloud computing simplifies some aspects of DR, it complicates others. For one, it ties us to the RPO and RTOs of our cloud service provider. We also may have security concerns. So before you start picking a cloud partner that's going to be part of your DR strategy, make sure you understand what their RPO windows and RTO windows are. Make sure you understand how they protect your data, because even though it will make your data more available, it could complicate things in other ways. So answers to these questions are ultimately going to help us start to define our recovery targets. Recovery targets specify what in SharePoint we want to protect by mapping business processes to SharePoint functional areas. And as with many other things, we prioritize in terms of RPO, RTO, and dollars. So a business constituent may come to you and say, hey, I need to restore the HR intranet in the event of a disaster. And a savvy administrator may go, hey, the HR intranet, I know that that's going to need a SharePoint farm. We need the content database that has the HR site collection. We need to make sure BCS is up and running. We may need the secure store service for BCS credential sets, maybe even InfoPath. All of these bullets are recovery targets. Recovery targets are really just the technical way of mapping what a user tells us to a set of systems that we can actually protect and prioritize. So we need to identify recovery targets. And of course, also during this phase, we need to define an appropriate combination of strategies and technologies to address our recovery targets. And this is where RPO and RTO really come in, because I can tell you without a doubt there are going to be certain RPO and RTO windows that immediately rule out certain strategies, because most backup strategies do not allow us to do things like instantaneous backups or instantaneous restore. So we have to look at things like high availability, additional servers, other farms that we can fail to. RPO and RTO are going to help us determine if backup and restore will work for us or if we need to use high availability. In reality, oftentimes we use a combination of the two, because if we look at the factors that are involved when making a selection, backup and restore versus high availability, there's oftentimes a very big cost differential. Backup and restore tends to be a bit looser when it comes to RPO and RTO, but it's going to be the less expensive option. High availability, on the other hand, allows us to address more aggressive RPO and RTO values, but it's going to be more expensive. And I have examples down at the bottom of each of built-in mechanisms within Windows, within SQL Server, that allow us to do backup and restore as well as high availability. And of course, there is a great third-party ecosystem for this stuff as well. Now, virtualization in the cloud, of course, complicate this as well, because virtualization becomes a way to achieve high availability in some cases. The cloud gives us some other place to back up to. These are going to factor into your selection. Just make sure you're working with RPO and RTO, and make sure that you understand what solutions you're looking at, what they can do for you in terms of addressing the particular windows you've got. So one question I typically get, okay, that's great, thanks for all that. What should I actually protect? Well, I don't like to get too simple with it, but at a minimum, if we're looking at just critical items, if this is the sound blurb or sound bite that somebody's going to grab, we need to protect databases, specifically content databases, but service app databases, because we may have some business data there. Solution packages are a good thing to keep an eye on. These are all your third-party full trust solutions. If you're in the cloud, you don't have these. If you're in Microsoft's cloud, you may have another hosted solution like Rackspace. They may allow you to install solution packages, but your WISPs are important to keep a handle on. And then, of course, documentation, what your farm looks like, what your servers are configured to do, and, of course, accounts and permissions. These are the important usernames and passwords. That is the best distillation of this I can give, because oftentimes I'll get the question, okay, I need a list of everything I need to protect. Well, the reality is there's no definitive list of everything, because no two SharePoint farms or DR plans are the same. I used to give a talk on backup targets specifically, and this is one of the slides that I would zoom in and out of for backup targets. As you can see, when I distill this down to a list of technical targets on the left-hand side, we can really get down into the weeds. And this doesn't cover all the scenarios. You may have things in your environment that just don't fit into this picture. The point of the picture, though, is to say that I can't give you a prescriptive list. You have to look in your environment to figure out what you need. And from there, make your list and protect your targets accordingly. So of course documentation is going to be important. Documentation spans this phase, the planning phase, as well as the next, but let's be honest, documentation spans every phase of the DR process. But there is a particular focus on it in this phase and the next phase. So we're getting into the home stretch here. We need to go to implementation. So we've done our planning. Implementation is where the rubber meets the road, where we need to write our plans and assemble our resources. Now, writing plans is a stumbling block for many folks who are new to disaster recovery. How do I write a recovery plan? Well, it probably isn't a surprise to hear me say that most organizations are very protective of their recovery plans. They don't like those being shared with other people. But I can give you the characteristics of writing a good recovery plan. The cop-out answer is to tell you to start by talking to those in your organizations who have some responsibility for business continuity. You may have an office in your company that is tasked with business continuity. If you do, consult them first. Now, if you don't, here are some characteristics for writing a good recovery plan. The plan should address a discrete system or subsystem. You don't need to boil the ocean, but be very targeted in how you focus a plan. Because any given system, SharePoint can be many things to many people. You may have multiple recovery plans for SharePoint. Clearly identify any assumptions that are made in your plan. Assumptions from a hardware perspective, from software. This is really important with SharePoint because if our strategy, for instance, involves rebuilding a farm, we're going to need certain hardware in place, we're going to need certain software in place, Windows Server needs to be laid down, SQL Server needs to be laid down. We may be relying on other external systems, dependent system restores. We also may need somebody with a certain level of knowledge to execute the plan. Identify these assumptions up front when you're writing the plan. I also like to identify participants and the role they play in the plan, typically by group or company rather than by individual. Because what this does, if you do this in terms of a role or a group, what you get away from is saying, hey, we need to have Bob available to do this restore. If Bob is the guy who always works with SharePoint and Bob wrote the recovery plan, there's a decent chance there are hidden assumptions in that recovery plan. Find somebody besides Bob to try and execute the plan to see if it really is written in a way that's somebody else, because Bob may get another job tomorrow. He may walk out the door before your disaster and you may not have access to Bob. So make sure that plan doesn't rely on a specific individual. Your plan needs to outline steps for recovery in explicit detail written to the lowest common denominator without requiring specialized knowledge. What do I mean by that? I typically make an assumption that somebody is not a SharePoint expert but works in IT. Working in IT is usually a good lowest common denominator. And this is, you might recall during the assessment phase, I talked about documenting how SharePoint works. Because if we're writing for the lowest common denominator, if we're just writing for somebody in our IT staff to execute a recovery plan, and that person doesn't know SharePoint, having some information as part of our documentation can help. And this can be a dump from TechNet or something like that, but try to keep it simple so that you're not building in a hidden requirement for a very specialized level of SharePoint knowledge. This step is critical. This point is critical. For each step, potential missteps should be spelled out along with corrective actions. Think about working with SharePoint, going to a PowerShell prompt. For you IT pros out there, how many of you go out to a PowerShell prompt in SharePoint, run a particular commandlet or run a script? How many of these execute 100% of the time with success? How many of you have had to run the script more than one time because it fails the first time? You know, you're bleeding red all over the SharePoint, all over the command prompt. You run the script again and it goes through. We know this about SharePoint, but if somebody is executing a recovery plan and sees that error dump, they may panic. And during a disaster, you don't want people panicking. So if you know that something's going to break, call it out and perhaps just tell somebody, hey, this may not work the first time. Run it again if it doesn't. And very important, specify objective criteria or confirmation for success. I've run the plan. Is SharePoint back up and working? Who knows? This may be as simple as, say, navigating to default.aspx in a particular site collection and seeing if a page comes up that looks like this screenshot. That may work for you, but don't just assume that because the plan's been executed, everything's working. It may not be the case. And then finally, post-recovery notes to direct personnel to further actions or plans that are tied to your current plan can be really helpful. Hey, you just restored this particular function in SharePoint. You may be interested in Plan 7, Plan 10, which bring back business intelligence, maybe bring back public sites, something like that. Help people along, because a disaster, most of us in a disaster will take any help we can get, and we're not necessarily thinking on our feet all of the time. So these sorts of things really help folks who have to execute your recovery plans. Piece of cake, right? Well, the reality is no, it's not. Recovery plans are living documents. You're going to iterate over them over and over again. Nobody gets it right the first time. So writing plans, that's certainly part of the implementation, but assembling resources is the other side. Now, I'm not going to assume that many of you who work with SharePoint are tasked with these things, but if you're in a small organization and you're like me or in a similar position to what I was in the past, we had to actually come up with our own facilities, the hardware and things that needed to go into those facilities. These are just some of the things to consider. You can skip over this if you don't have a need for it, but if you're doing this for the first time, this may be of assistance to you. And finally, don't lose sight, because our SharePoint recovery plans don't exist in a vacuum. They're tying in, remember, they tie into one or more larger business continuity plans, or BCPs. So within our recovery plans, we should make tie-ins for communications, criteria for DR plan activation. We need to document manual workarounds, as well as integration points with other DR plans. And I talk about activation. Activation is an important one to call out, because I'm going to venture a guess that some of you are in a similar situation that I've been in the past, where a number of users start calling in saying that SharePoint's down. They can't get to their site collection. You as an IT pro go in, you look at the farm is completely up, but users say it's down. Is that a disaster? Well, if you can't answer that objectively, perhaps you need to put some criteria around it. For some organizations, that may qualify as a disaster. SharePoint seldom completely dies. It's usually some component of it. But from an end-user perspective and a usability perspective, going down may involve less than a complete loss of the entire farm. So document plans for activation, or at least criteria. And then finally, we get to maintenance, or as I jokingly like to call it, the part that many of us wish would simply go away. Hey, I've done my DR time. I've written my plan. Can I be paroled? I don't want to be here anymore. So what's included in maintenance? Well, exercises that test and validate our DR plans. We need to account for updates to our plans as our SharePoint environments change. And then we need to budget for this, both in terms of time and money. Testing. Testing is critical. Testing can help you do several things. First, without a test, you're not going to be able to identify gaps in the plan so that you can address them before a disaster. Don't write the plan and then never test it. You'll have no idea if it works. A testing can also help us validate that we actually hit our RPO, and especially our RTO targets. If you've got a 4-hour RTO window and you've never actually executed your recovery plan, you're really gambling. You don't know if you can hit that 4-hour window, so you have to test to prove it. And something that sometimes gets lost, with repetition, you can actually reduce your RTO, because as you practice recovery exercises, many organizations a couple times a year on a weekend will get together and conduct DR exercises. If you execute a recovery plan multiple times, maybe it takes you 4 hours the first time to do it, but by the 6th time, you're down to 3 hours. Well, guess what? That extra hour saved, remember from our business impact analysis, we have some mapping that identifies how much our organization is losing financially for each hour of downtime. So the better you get with this, technically, the more you save your organization. But the bottom line is, without testing, you'll never actually know if your recovery plans work. They're just words on paper until you've actually used them. So please make time for testing. You need to update your plan, because last time I checked, most people don't have SharePoint environments that look exactly as they did when they were first rolled out. RPOs and RTOs can change. Farms can grow and evolve, adopt new purposes. For instance, maybe you were just using SharePoint for collaboration, and then somebody went and added a business-critical dashboard to that environment. Guess what? That's probably going to force a reevaluation of what your RPO and RTO windows are. Your DR facilities may change. You may go off-site from on-site. These are all good times to review your plans and make changes, because your plans are technically living documents. And what I like to tell people, don't leave your recovery plans to become undead, because I guarantee you, if you write a recovery plan and walk away from it and 3 years later something goes wrong, somebody's going to dig up that plan. And if they're blowing dust off of it and it does not bear any resemblance to the SharePoint environment in its current form, they will curse your name. So don't leave your recovery plans to become undead. They're living documents. They don't go away just because you abandon them. They may take on an unlife of their own. So just a couple of words left. Budgeting, time, and money. Of course, we need time for things like DR tests, reviewing and maintaining our plans, auditing if that's important, and really, isomorphically, money and time are the same thing, right? So you also need to account for salary costs associated with testing, any of your facilities, licensing costs. I have an asterisk there because many organizations don't know this, but if you talk to your vendors, oftentimes you can get a break on licensing costs for licenses that are used in a DR facility, so it's worth asking. And then, of course, if you need independent auditing, you may have to pay for that too. So really, this is the DR process, and the dirty secret is nobody gets this right the first time. That's why it's a continuous process. So don't feel bad. You just need to go over it again and again. Now, we're near the end of our presentation here. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that the NIST has a publication. So for those of you in the U.S., you can actually go out and see how the federal government does contingency planning for federal information systems. And this may give you some ideas. You'll hear some of the things I'm talking about echoed in this document, but it certainly goes into more than I've covered. So it may be worth it for you. So to wrap things up, the order of operations, risk analysis, BIA, all that filters down into a DR plan. RPO and RTO are critical. They drive how we do DR and the DR planning decisions we make. Remember, SharePoint is unique. Your environment is unique. No two DR plans are going to be identical either. And then finally, recovery plans are living documents. You'll constantly need to test and revise them. Here's my information. If you want to contact me, SharePoint Interface is my blog. Our disaster recovery guide, John Farringer and I wrote these. Even though we're several versions of SharePoint down the road now, these are still relevant because a lot of the process stuff I'm talking about is in these guides as well. And so that is just about everything, and we're about 1 minute over here. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Tony?
Yeah, Sean. Hi, I'm here. Yeah, I definitely did enjoy your presentation. We didn't receive any questions related to the presentation. We received a lot of compliments for your book, so maybe we can wait a couple of minutes to see if somebody has a question for Sean that he can answer right now. Otherwise, you can send us an email, and Sean promised to do a blog post if there are any questions that were left unanswered.
Yeah, I always try to help.
Just compliments for the books, and I can definitely say that I met Sean initially when I bought this book, and if I remember correctly, it was an e-book version, and there was some issue with the book, and then Sean was kind enough to help me to get the proper version that worked on my device, whatever it was at that time.
Don't give away my secrets, Tony.
So we have one question. Where can we get the Gearhead DR info? I'm not sure if I understood that question correctly.
If you pull down, if it's something in my slides, like I said, the slides will be up on my blog a little bit later, SharePointInterface.com. If it's something from within the presentation, I can't, of course, easily go back to a previous frame, but you'd be able to pull down the presentation from here. Tony, I think that you guys may make it available on your site or at least point to mine. So there'll be a couple different ways to get this presentation. And then if it's something that was in the presentation or a link in the presentation, just pull down the slides for this whole presentation. You'll be able to go back through and find those URLs.
I think that answers the question. So everything will be available. We are going to send all of you guys an email with all this info, and that will be useful. Okay, so we have one more question. Sean, do you want for me to read it, or you can open the Q&A box?
Let's see here. I don't see it. I've got a chat window open, but
okay,
yeah, if you could read it, that'd be great.
Question. I can read it. So Henrik wants to know: do you do tests on your DR plans in production or acceptance environment? And if you have a 24-hour backup window, then you lose data. So if you don't do a DR test in production, how do you know if it works?
Yes, the chicken and egg question. Do you test in production? Generally, no. Most organizations don't. They strive to create alternate environments that are as close to production as possible. For organizations that rely on high availability strategies, you may see situations where organizations, for instance, that maintain multiple data centers will routinely fail from one data center to another in a controlled fashion in order to test each of their facilities as well as their DR strategies at the same time. But in the event, if you're a mere mortal, like many of us are, and you're working with, for instance, a production farm that you can't take out of the loop, what you're going to want to do is set up an alternate facility or try and do a recovery with raw hardware. It really depends on your approach to protecting data. So if you're relying on backup strategies, you're going to have a second farm where you try to restore that data and bring SharePoint up in a somewhat isolated environment. I know folks who use things like mirroring. Prior to always on, folks would do mirroring, and of course if you fail from your primary to your mirror, then that creates some sorts of problems for failing back. It's really hard to test everything without an actual disaster itself, but you try to set up an environment that's going to be as close as possible to your production environment, and then try there. I don't know if that specifically answers the question or not, but hopefully that helps.
We don't have any more questions, so we should just wrap it up here. And thank you guys for attending. Thank you, Sean, for speaking for us. And we will send you guys a recording so you can analyze everything Sean tried to explain to you today. Thank you, Sean.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I had a good time. Take care,
everyone. Have a nice day. Bye.
Yep. Bye.